The Porsche door slammed like a verdict, a glint of chrome, the ricochet of a closing gate, the late afternoon sun slicing across the yellow paint of a small house that had outlived 2 wars and countless birthdays. On the porch, Marta's hands, dusted with flour from a pan she had left warming, stopped moving. Valdemar stood beside her, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, the tiny crescent of salt and pepper hair at his temple trembling as if it were listening for a sound it already knew. Flávio didn't look back. He never did when he wanted a clean break. He'd learned to close doors that way, sharp, efficient, impossible to reopen without choosing to do so. He stepped from the car like a man leaving a theater, accomplished, sure, the codified posture of success. He'd rehearsed the phrase, the cadence, the cruelty in a dozen variants in the sleepless nights leading up to this. Now that it was happening, it felt almost clean, like slicing a loose thread. "Never come back," he said, and the words hit the porch like a thrown stone. They were ridiculous words for a house that had been a harbor for him, for scraped knees and whispered promises. They belonged in a film, in a headline, not in the living room where his childhood smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. The camera in his assistant's bag, polished, discreet, caught everything. So did the phone of a neighbor pushing her stroller through the alley. Someone uploaded a 30-second clip before the sky had surrendered to dusk. Marta's smile didn't snap like a twig. It was a small, stubborn thing, an ember of habit more than joy. She folded that smile in on itself and turned the plate in her hands until it was a small wheel. "Flávio," she said, and her voice held a question shaped by years of forgiving him, years of standing outside his storms with an umbrella no one thanked her for. He had expected bargaining. He had expected pleading, or maybe the quiet dignity of people who knew when to smooth the last creases of a relationship. Instead, he found the slow, unpracticed calm of people who had been hurt before but not broken. That calm made him angrier than any pleading would have. "Pack," he told them. His words were neat, surgical. "I can't have you here. It's not safe for the image. There's too much at stake." He said image with the finality of someone who had learned to value perceptions as currency. In his mind, the company pitch that night needed every bit of sheen. A photograph of an elderly couple on the porch could be spun anyway. He imagined investors whispering about liabilities and reputational risk. He imagined Rogerio's raised eyebrow, Rogerio who had never been subtle with a knife. He imagined the contracts on the table, each clause a ligature around their future. So he spoke as if he were protecting currency by destroying memory. Valdemar's hands were calloused, the kind that carried small wars across factory floors, and the slow bloom of a business grown in silence. He straightened, the old man's spine a map of ledgers and long days. For a moment he stepped forward, as if to proofread the harsh phrase that had been hurled at him. "You're right," Valdemar said, softly, not the rebuke Flávio deserved. "We'll go." They moved with the slowness of people who have nothing left to prove. Marta tucked a linen towel over a stack of plates, as if to protect them even now. Valdemar crossed the room and, with a small, almost casual motion, pulled open the bottom drawer of the old oak console that had stood beneath the window for as long as anyone could remember. There it was, a safe. Not the kind of cinematic wall safe you saw in movies, but a heavy, squat steel box with a dial dulled by years of hands and a brass tag that read, Valdemar, 1957. Flávio's eyes caught it. He had never noticed the safe before. He had noticed the family photos, the marks on the doorframe that measured his growth, the medals collecting dust on the shelf. He had never considered his grandfather a keeper of secrets. In his mind, Valdemar had been a quiet figure who worked while the world applauded other faces. He had not considered he might have been building something behind his back, like a ship built in someone's backyard, silent, solid, incomprehensible until it slid down the ramp and met the water. Valdemar closed the drawer with a thud that sounded final. Marta folded her hands as if in prayer, though there was no God to call. Outside, a child on a bicycle clicked the camera on his phone again, and the clip found its way into the vast, hungry current of the internet. If you want to see what the safe really hid, stay with me until the end. The clip was merciless in its simplicity. Two wealthy-looking strangers in a slick car, a young man in a tailored jacket ordering the removal of his elders, the avaux and avaux standing like a small island against a tide. The comment field filled, outrage stacked upon judgment. Unforgivable, someone wrote. Elder abuse, said another. How can someone treat their grandparents like trash? The video hummed out like a fever. It took 2 hours for the first investor email to land. It came with the sort of politeness that is really a blade. Given recent developments, it read, we must reassess our exposure. Contracts began to vanish like smoke when you open a window. Rogeria sent a terse message. We need distance. Daniela's hands trembled when she dialed, then steadied herself and left a voicemail that made no promise. The company's PR feed went silent for minutes that stretched into the kind of eternity made of broken glass. Journalists smelled blood. Social media smelled spectacle. At the office the next morning, the downtown glass tower felt suddenly like a stage set. Flavio's colleagues wore concern like a costume. Some looked at him as if he might crack at any moment. Others avoided him entirely, as if proximity could infect them with the same disgrace.
His phone buzzed with numbers he didn't recognize. The top headline was a snatch of his own voice. He paced the length of the boardroom like a man counting ceiling tiles by accident. The world reeled, and he couldn't find his center. Panic is a new currency for the unrepentant. It makes you feel poor in a way that your bank account can't explain. When the first creditor called, the voice was small and efficient. We need to discuss collateral, the woman said. We can't operate with material, reputational risk linked to your personal brand. Collateral. Reputation as a mortgage. The idea lodged like a splinter. Flávio tried to argue, to explain that this was a family matter, an unfortunate moment. He argued with the same blunt force he had used on his grandparents, expecting clarity in exchange for bluntness. It didn't come. His explanations were pickaxes on soft stone. They only widened the fissures. He'd been raised on stories of builders. Valdemar had been one, his hands brutal and kind, the man who turned bleak spaces into factories and then into livelihoods. For Flávio, those stories had been wallpaper, background music to his ambitious ascent. When he was 30, wearing suits that hung on him like second skins, Valdemar paid the tuition no one knew about, co-signed on loans he didn't name, whispered encouragement from the shadows. It never looked like charity to him. It looked like an obligation from one generation to another. He'd never asked about receipts. That was why they were family. He thought money could be severed from gratitude. He would find out it could not. By noon, a small crowd had gathered outside the house where Marta and Valdemar had once lived. Reporters swarmed like flies. A cameraman asked the avós, the lens hungry for a line that would translate easily into a morning headline. An older woman, Irene, the neighbor with knitted scarves and a propensity for meddling, stood with her arms crossed. She had lived on the street longer than anyone else, and had seen families rise and fold like laundry. She held a thermos and watched quietly as the world telescoped into that small porch. Valdemar answered questions the way a man answers the weather, factual, unembellished. He said things that didn't please the cameras because they weren't sound bites. I raised him, he said. We did what we could. He didn't ask for pity. He didn't explain his reasons because there was no reason that could be articulated in 10 seconds for a breaking news segment. The safe sat behind him as if it were a quiet witness to every line spoken. Someone zoomed a camera in on the dial, the brass tag. That shot, innocuous as a still life, became in the hours to come something that would drag the names of everyone involved into the cold light of legal scrutiny. At the company, lawyers circled. An internal memo advised restraint. An external statement was drafted and revised until it meant nothing.
Flávio's boardroom became a tribunal of suits and measured faces. One by one, investors asked for reassurances they had no intention of waiting for. One by one, contracts were paused, then terminated. Loans that had been extended on the sheen of his reputation were called in informally. Nothing dramatic, nothing instantaneous, but the language of the calls implied measures that would make life very small and very public for him. He drove back to the house that evening because he had to, not to apologize, not yet. There was a thing you do when the mat beneath your feet starts to tear. You return to the origin point to see what has been altered. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to repair the fissure or pretend it had never happened. He noticed the safe as he came up the path. It wasn't locked in a melodramatic way. The dial had small fingerprints on it like constellations. He'd only ever seen it as part of the room's furniture, a thing old men kept. Now it glared at him like an accusation, a small metallic sun. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded before he could filter the question into something less raw. Marta wiped her hands on the towel and looked at him with a softness that made him feel small, which was something he did not like. "We didn't hide it to deceive," she said. "We hid it to be safe. There are things in there that hurt to tell." Valdemar reached into the drawer and lifted the safe's lid with a slow, ritual gesture. He had always been ceremonious with things that mattered. Inside were envelopes folded in precise lines, yellowing photographs bound by a rubber band, a small leather notebook with a spine worn by thumbs, and a thumb drive tucked in a corner like contraband. Flávio felt the room shrink. Something like curiosity and dread crawled its way up his spine. What is all this? Valdemar's hand found his shoulder. "Documents," he said simply. "Promises. Paper and memory." He thought, testaments, wills, property lines. He thought, the quiet accounting of a life. He thought, the money he had assumed would be his, the safety net he had never considered was anything but guaranteed. That night he sat on the curb as if the pavement were a bench and replayed a life of unexamined advantages. The city lights blurred into a smear of indifferent stars. He found for the first time that silence was heavier than the loudest applause. Word kept coming. A local talk show reran the clip with a commentator who knew how to turn private cruelty into civic sermon. Names were typed with the ease of people who knew exposure was a commodity and shame was a cheap currency. The company's name near his was bracketed with question marks. At home, messages piled up. Threats from activists, offers of legal counsel, a private message from Ruggiero asking for a meeting with the briskness of a man who smelled a corner to be cut. Daniela texted 3 words, "We can fix this." The charade of control was becoming a paper tiger.
By the second day, Flávio had traded his usual shirts for a hoodie left on the back of a chair, not because he wanted to be invisible, but because the hoodie felt like armor against a world that now scrolled past him with judgment. He stopped at a cafe to clear his head and found 3 older men who knew him nodding with something like compassion. He left without ordering. The company sent him home with an indefinite leave of absence. They called it time to reflect. The phrase was polite and precise. What it meant was exile. He had provided them with a moment too hot to touch. That night, when he returned to the house to find Marta actually packing a small suitcase, not for show, but for leaving, he saw the photographs pinned over the mantel. There was one of a little boy with a gap-toothed grin, Valdemar's arm thrown across his shoulders. There was one of a young couple on a balcony, the 2 of them not yet strangers. In the corner, behind a crooked frame, the safe glinted as if it were a private moon. He knelt and traced a face in a photo, the face of a child who had been given more than he knew how to keep, and something cold and impossibly heavy uncoiled in his chest. He had stripped their dignity for the comfort of a boardroom. He had reduced history to optics. He had, in the name of protecting a brand, exposed a body that had sheltered him. He imagined, with a clarity that felt like a wound, the small sacrifices he had ignored, the extra hours Valdemar worked, the low-profile loans his grandfather had made without comment, the decisions to direct small incomes into unglamorous fixes that had, over decades, become the quiet scaffolding of a family. He had believed money could be separated from gratitude. He had been wrong. A notification lit up his phone, a message from Enrique, the family lawyer. It read simply, "We need to speak. Urgent. Come by the office." He stared at it, the afternoon color of the porch retreating to shadows. "Why does the lawyer want to see me?" he asked, more to himself than the room. Marta folded the towel and met his eyes. "There are papers," she said, voice careful. "Your grandfather kept the safe locked because there were instructions." He laughed, a short bark that itched like regret. "For instructions for what? For tea? For telling me I was being ungrateful?" Valdemar's face was a map. "Not for tea," she said. "For the future." The future. The irony was a lead weight. Enrique had been Valdemar's friend before he became the man who wrote legalese. He was a man with a head of hair too full for his age, and an affinity for phrases like "in the event of." When Flávio arrived, Enrique's suit had the tired polish of someone who'd been awake for the sake of preserving other people's certainties. He didn't stand. He gestured to a chair and poured 2 glasses of water like a man who used ceremony to slow conversations he suspected would bruise. "Mr. Costa," Enrique started, formal as if he were addressing the public record. "Or Flávio." Flávio sat. The chair creaked like an old confession booth. "What's this about?" he asked before niceties could congeal into distance. Enrique folded his hands. He opened a folder and set it on the desk like a small island. "Your grandfather prepared a will," he said. "He left provisions." Flávio exhaled, thinking of bank accounts, trust funds, the kind of passive wealth that arrives silently in your life and requires no skill to spend. A cool assurance fluttered up in him for a moment,
Then it was snipped. But, Enrique continued, there's also a clause. The phrase hit him with a strange tenderness. Clauses were dry, manageable things, but the way Enrique said it made it sound like a verdict. What kind of clause? Flávio asked, the question smaller than the panic that was beginning to fidget at the edges of his thoughts. An obligation, Enrique said slowly, not in the sense of punishment, in the sense of condition. Valdemar wanted to ensure his legacy was honored, not squandered. Conditioned on what? Flávio pressed. Enrique's eyes flicked to the window, where the city moved on indifferently. He insisted on the care and respect of his parents' last years, Enrique said. He made the distribution contingent on certain behaviors, treatment, how they were sheltered, the dignity with which they were looked after. There was a pause, the kind that is filled with a falling sound. Flávio felt it in his mouth like a sour note. That's ridiculous, he said. You can't. I'm not a judge, Enrique said, calm. But a will is a legal instrument, and his wishes were written clearly. There is language to ensure his intentions are carried out. He created a safe harbor for his assets. He also made it irrevocable to a point. He took steps so it could not be changed easily. Irrevocable. The word slotted into his head like a nail. Flávio thought of the safe, the dial, the faded brass tag. He thought of photographs folded like prayers inside it. He thought of Valdemar, so certain about responsibility that it convinced him responsibility was optional. He thought of the 30-second clip that had become a public condemnation. And the clip? He asked, because it hovered between them like smoke. Does it change anything? Enrique shifted in his chair and reached into the folder. He pulled out a photocopy, enlarged, stark, and set it on the desk. It was a shot of the safe, a close-up of the tag and the dial. It changes the perception, he said. Perception matters. But this, his finger traced a line on the page, this is what I'm concerned with. The will references explicit, non-negotiable clauses, the kind that can trigger redistribution if breached. Redistribution. The word felt like a plunger pulled, sucking his sense of entitlement down. Flávio tried to imagine his life without the scaffold he believed he'd built. He pictured the cars gone, the office empty, clients turning elsewhere. He could see headlines with his name, less than it had seemed possible as a child, when his grandfather's small favors had been invisible to him. He felt suddenly very far from everything he had assumed was permanent. You're saying I could lose everything, he said, the sentence a poor thing, stretched over a chasm. Enrique didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He tasted words with the carefulness of a man who knew their weight. I'm saying there are consequences if the wishes in that instrument are not honored. That is all I'm saying for now. At home, the safe sat like a sleeping animal. The photograph on the mantel had slid a fraction, revealing the corner of a letter Marta had folded away. The house had a smell of lemon and old paper, and somewhere in the background, the city sighed. The viral clip continued its life online, a small beast that eats and multiplies. The first donations to a hastily created online fund for elder care appeared, as people searched for a way to assuage the outrage they'd felt watching the clip. The world was offering reparations in microscopic amounts. Flávio lay awake that night with the city's heartbeat in his ears, and the image of his grandfather's hands on the safe burned into his skin. He had been an instrument of his own exile, a man who'd cut a cord and expected the sail to stay there, intact, without a mast. He had forgotten that some things in life are not liabilities, but people, bodies of months and memories, and the particular, stubborn dignity of those who had given you a roof without asking for a receipt. The next morning he woke early and walked to the kitchen. Marta had a pot of coffee strong enough to be a sermon. Valdemar sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug as if it were an offering. He was different in the morning light, more vulnerable, more present. They ate quietly. Valdemar watched him with a gaze that felt both like forgiveness and a question. If you think this will be easy, Valdemar said, you're wrong. But if you think it's only about money, you're worse wrong. Flávio swallowed. What do you mean? Valdemar picked up the small leather notebook from the table, the one with the worn spine. He had been putting things into notebooks for decades, receipts, lists, small confessions. Sometimes he wrote down the name of a man who had given work. Sometimes he wrote the time he had seen his own son take a job on a different morning. I kept record, Valdemar said, not to show off, to remember, to be accountable. He slid the notebook across to Flávio. The pages were dense with handwriting, dates, names, the small arithmetic of a life of giving. There were entries that explained how a loan had been quietly secured, how a small property had been mortgaged to bail out a partner who had failed, how a line of credit had been signed in a moment when the family needed breath. The ink had the stoic clarity of someone who believed in doing and not in telling. "You used what we built," Valdemar said, his voice a mixture of accusation and tired compassion. "But you never asked what built it. You took and never learned the cost." Flavio's chest tightened. He had never been taught to read the cost behind generosity. He had been trained to see outcomes and to measure them. Now he read the ledger and felt the grief of someone discovering a house of hidden rooms they had been born into. He thought about the safe again, about what it might hold, about the envelopes and the thumb drive tucked in the corner like a secret. If the will had a clause, then the safe was its altar. If the safe sat closed in the house, then he had been trying to strike at the altar without knowing its gods. The lawyer called in the middle of the afternoon, as if he were calling to set a meeting for surgery. "There's a schedule for review," Enrique said. "It will take time. Meanwhile, there are questions from stakeholders. Be careful when you speak." "Be careful?" Flávio echoed, suddenly weary of being advised to put on a face he didn't feel. "How do I speak when the whole world thinks I'm a monster?" Enrique's voice softened. "Let it be an opportunity if it can be. Men have changed for less." That phrase crawled under his skin. Men have changed for less. It implied possibility, but it also implied effort. It implied proving a thing that can't be proven with bank statements. When he hung up, Flávio found himself on the stoop of the house with a bag in his hand. Marta and Valdemar had stopped packing for the night. Irene stood by the fence with the thermos, watching as if a storm might blow by and rearrange the street. "Do you want help?" Irene asked, practical as always. He looked at his grandparents, their hands moving, their faces mapped with the small decisions of a life, and for a moment he felt himself less like a son and more like a passerby caught in a weather front. He could fix this with magic, he thought, with money and charm. He could call his PR people, hire a crisis manager, stage a contrition that would soothe the feeds. He could buy back the old illusions with enough clearing of bank accounts. But there was a thing inside him that he had never let speak, a tiny, almost childish shame that wanted to be understood rather than defended. He wanted to be forgiven because he wanted the weight lifted without paying the price. He wanted the easy absolution. Marta caught his eye and nodded toward the safe. Her movement was small, almost imperceptible. It was an invitation to know. He hesitated because knowledge requires humility, and he had not come equipped for humility. But he unlocked the safe and drew out an envelope stamped with Valdemar's handwriting, neat and precise. The paper smelled like dust and ink and an old certainty. On the outside, in a hand he recognized as his grandfather's, there was his name.
He didn't open it in front of them. He walked down the garden, the warm earth cold under his bare feet, and sat on the step. He slit the flap with a fingernail, and the paper released a small breath. Inside were words he had always expected and never imagined would be framed like an ultimatum. Beneath the legalese and the polite formulations, Valdemar had written lines that were at once both a command and a plea. He had written of dignity and of care. He had written of expectations and of consequences. The first line made his throat close. He read it 3 times, as if repetition could unroll the knot. He was supposed to provide care. If he did not, the instruments were to be redirected. There were names of charities, institutions with addresses written in a steady hand, and an additional clause that felt like an afterthought, penciled with the gentleness of someone trying not to scorch a wound. A possibility of redemption, a path back if true change could be demonstrated. He sat on the step until the sky turned the color of bruised fruit, the paper a cool thing on his knees. He thought of his car in the driveway, of the office with its glass walls, of the contracts dangling like fruit he could no longer reach. He thought of the clip burning through the world to tension like a splintering log. He imagined what coming back would mean. It would be humility. It would be labor. It would be returning to the hands that had once smoothed his hair and being told, perhaps, that love is not a contract. It would be heavy and small and necessary. He looked up and saw Enrique's number flash on his phone again. This time when he answered, his voice was steadier, quieter. "There's more than the clause," Enrique said. "There's an instrument of guarantee tied to some of your," he faltered slightly, as if trying not to pronounce a ruin, "to the loans that were extended. In simplistic terms, some obligations were tied to your grandfather's credit. The breach could expose you financially in ways you don't expect." Flavio's mind tried to spin the gears of finance into reasons why this could be fixed. The lawyer's words were clinical. They didn't say that the bank could freeze. They didn't say that auctions would be scheduled. But the implication alone was enough to make the ground shift. "I need time," Flávio said, more to study himself than to ask.
Enrique's silence was polite and measured. "Time is a currency, Mr. Costa," he said, "but not always one you can spend." When he hung up, the phone screen was a small, cold window into a life that had been built with help he had not acknowledged. The safe inside the house felt both like a treasure and an indictment. The viral clip spun like a cyclone, and in the middle of all of it was a man who had just discovered how thin the skin of his certainties had been. He walked back to the porch. Marta was sitting on the steps now, the light folding around her shoulders.
Valdemar stood at the gate, looking at the road as if it might tell him what to do next. "Will you come with me?" Flávio asked, and the question was less about logistics and more about direction. Marta looked at him in a way that dissolved defenses. "We leave when it's right to leave," she said, "not because some car tells us to." Valdemar turned and folded his hands as if the world were an event he had to attend to with cautious pride. "We will travel light," he said, "but we are not light ourselves." The safe in the house clicked closed by accident, the dial spinning to a stop. It hid its contents in the dark, and for now that was enough. Outside, the world continued to rotate on its axis of outrage and curiosity. Inside, the family sat with the newly revealed map of a life. The next steps were a tangle of obligations, of choices, of the slow arithmetic of atonement. He had said, with a voice that would be played back for millions, "Never come back." The words had landed and rippled. Now the ripple returned to shore with consequences. He could spend the next weeks pounding at the shore with indignation, trying to undo the waves. Or he could step into them and feel the drag of current, the cold of acknowledgement. He did not know which would be easier. He only knew the safe existed, and what it hid would not remain a secret forever. The valley between shock and recompense yawned. When he closed the house's door that night, the hallway light painted a thin rectangle on the floor. The safe sat beneath that rectangle like a quiet ticking thing. He left without slamming any door this time. The night swallowed his footsteps and the hum of the city, and he went to a life that suddenly required him to choose between vanity and repair. The choice would shape more than bank accounts. It would shape him. He walked back toward the city lights, and somewhere in the distance a siren wove its way through the evening. The siren receded, leaving the night to its indifferent hum. Daylight came with small, ordinary cruelties. A voicemail from a bank manager asking to clarify our exposure. A terse email from an insurer, pausing coverage pending review. A message from a dealership, pending payment arrangements. Each note was a quiet tooth in the kind of machinery that chews through assumptions. By the end of the week, the first visible signs of erosion had arrived. The car that had been the emblem of his invulnerability was tagged with a polite notice and a latch on the wheel. It was not dramatic, no tow truck ballet on national television, but it felt theatrical in the way it reduced a man to a line item. The company's clients, who had once been patient about deadlines and quirks, sent their regrets. Invitations evaporated. Rogério, the partner who had greeted him with measured opportunism since university days, announced a freeze on new initiatives and scheduled a meeting to assess brand association. Even the two assistants who'd once buffered calls with practiced gentleness started answering with fewer pleasantries. He had long believed that wealth was a kind of invisibility cloak. Now he felt naked, not because the hoodie hugged him closer, but because all the things he used to hide behind, credit lines, cordial nods from other executives, glossy profile photos, were either gone or had become reasons for collagen-deep embarrassment. He spent one afternoon watching footage of himself on a morning show with a pundit leaning in like a vulture. He could hear his own voice and hate it with a purity that had never before found him. The legal processes moved with a respectable slowness that mocked him. Enrique explained each step with a calm that did not soothe. Liens could be placed, creditors could pursue guarantees, bank accounts could be frozen under suspicion of misapplied funds. Nothing was instantaneous, nothing was theatrical. The threat was more like a steady leak than a rupture. Yet drops do fill a bucket. "I can try to stall," Enrique said, "but there's leverage on the table, evidence of guarantee, documents showing he co-signed for certain credit lines. Those aren't things lenders dismiss easily." "Can I fight it?" Flávio asked, the question more about the art of denial than a plan of action. "You can," Enrique said. "You'll need to hire counsel, and the costs will be significant, and the public will complicate private negotiation."
By then, the social traffic had turned constant. Strangers left messages on every platform his name touched, some accusing, some moralizing, others oddly paternal, offering tough love. A few people called him by his childhood nickname, as if familiarity softened their judgment. The internet, with its appetite for story and scandal, had already moved on to the next flash, yet that did not mean the consequences evaporated. They sank into paperwork, into appointments, into the things that structure ordinary life. He learned to be small in a way that did not come naturally. Marta and Valdemar did not press him for apologies with the theatricality the feeds demanded. They moved in the slow, patient manner of people who had faith that actions, not headlines, reveal a person. Still, the sight of them packing a suitcase, Marta carefully folding a shawl, Valdemar tucking the leather notebook back into his jacket, was a more precise kind of punishment than any public shame. When his apartment manager arrived with an envelope of notices, the first real panic came. Overdue payments, a bank's letter of impending assessment. His chest tightened in a way that made his vision tunnel. He sold first the things that announced success but did not sustain him, an extra watch, an artwork he had acquired more for its label than for taste. And when those buyers came and saw his face, they offered less than he expected. Small humiliations accumulate into a larger ache. In the weeks that followed, humility became an occupation.
He applied for jobs the way people looked for rain in a drought, practically, with desperation disguised as professionalism. A recruiter called about a mid-level position he was overqualified for. An old classmate offered a consultancy role that required a public apology and a rehabilitation plan. He turned them down, not from pride, but from a strange reluctance to perform contrition that did not come from the heart. He took the job that required nothing but honesty, a delivery rider for a local courier. It was the kind of position Rogerio had told him once was a stage for up-and-comers to understand logistics. The irony didn't make it easier to accept. He bought a second-hand scooter with a credit card he barely had the right to use and started at dawn, the city still rubbing sleep from its eyes. At first, the work was mechanical and humiliating. He learned weight distribution, the map of one-way streets, the telltale squeal of brakes that needed attention. Colleagues nodded toward him with the kind of curiosity the world reserves for people oscillating between privation and privilege. A man in a reflective vest, who had a trim beard and a history of getting up earlier than terror required, offered him a tip. Keep your head down, learn the routes, treat people like humans. The advice was less aphorism than survival technique. He discovered things about the city he hadn't seen from behind a glass partition, a bakery where, at dawn, bakers moved with the solemnness of craftsmen, an elderly woman who tipped him with a home-cooked roll and asked about his grandmother, a team of nurses who happened to be the regulars at a cafe where he delivered sandwiches and who began to greet him by name. He learned the taste of the road, the metallic tang of rain hitting his helmet, the small thrill of arriving just in time, the steadiness of his breath after a sprint. Humiliation came in small, pointed cuts. Once, a client recognized him from the clip and stood on her stoop and said, loud enough for neighbors to hear, "You must have learned something, huh?" Her voice was not curious, it was vindictive. He answered with the only truth he had, "I am trying." The exchange rippled through a corridor of quietly embroidered judgments. But alongside the humiliations were moments of plain decency. A fellow courier, a lanky woman named Camilla, who'd been on the route longer, slid him a coffee on a cold morning and didn't ask why he was there. An older rider patched his flat tire without charging. The exchange of kindnesses was not dramatic. It was a series of small repairs. The house felt both closer and more distant now. Marta and Valdemar lived in a rhythm that the crisis had not upended. Meals at set times, a radio that played classical pieces in the background, a garden pot where tomatoes were coaxed on hopeful stems. The safe remained closed most of the time. Its presence was a punctuation mark in the domestic sentence. Sometimes at night, Flávio would find himself listening from the kitchen doorway as Marta hummed, a habit she had always kept, an anchor song that knew every mood. He stopped interrupting. He let the melody show him, again and again, the possibility of small reparation. The stress was not without effect. One evening, Valdemar took an extra step down from the stoop and felt his legs betray him. It was a small thing. He sat on the step, hand pressed to his chest, breath short, and Marta called an ambulance with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced this choreography. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and the tired kindness of overworked staff. Flávio followed in a borrowed taxi as if a hand pulled him along. Valdemar's diagnosis was not theatrical. The doctor spoke in straightforward sentences.
an episode of cardiac strain exacerbated by stress and fatigue. He needs rest, she said. He needs controlled activity and regular medications, no heavy lifting. Those words rearranged priorities. Sitting in the hospital waiting room was like reading the ledger of the family's life with a new lens. Flávio watched nurses wheel a man past who was older than his grandfather and still cracking jokes. He watched Marta hold her husband's hand with a tenderness that had always been there, but now seemed loud in its constancy. He felt an aching in his chest he had not had before, less panic and more of visceral recognition of what is owed beyond money. Monsieur, a social worker at the hospital who had the patient, practical voice of someone who had learned to translate bureaucracy into human terms, asked to speak with the family. He explained that the hospital could work with the family to arrange a care plan and suggested a community physiotherapy program. There are resources, he said, but someone has to coordinate them. Flávio volunteered, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps out of the simple desire to be useful. Coordinating meant an odd, welcome intimacy. Phone calls, organizing transport, arranging medication pickups. He began to be at the pharmacy before it opened, waiting behind retirees who grinned at him as if he were a new puzzle piece in an old picture. He learned to bring the right insurance card to the right counter, to keep a careful note of follow-up dates. At the hospital, the nurses noticed the change. They saw him sit through a night shift, hands folded, learning to refill water dispensers, to hold a patient's hand during tests. These nights did something to him, not because they were proof he deserved forgiveness, but because they made him feel the small, repetitive labor of another life. On the second night, a nurse named Lucia leaned over and said, "Your grandfather's strong. He sleeps better when someone is here." Flávio said nothing, but he sat up straighter. In the weeks that followed, Enrique arranged a family meeting with the executor of the will and representatives of the charities named in the document.
The executor, a woman with the calm authority of someone who understood both paper and people, explained the mechanics with careful clarity. Valdemar had set up a trust with a clause that redirected assets to named charities should the conditions be breached. She had already initiated the administrative steps required to begin that redirection. Those steps were not instantaneous transfers. They were administrative processes that, once underway, were difficult to reverse. The charities would receive disbursements as the estate's accounts were settled and liens resolved. But there is also a mechanism for restorative action, she continued. Mr. Costa wrote not only a clause of redirection, but a provision for partial restoration upon demonstration of sustained, verifiable change. He named 3 trustees and asked that the community's input be considered. Camille, the executor, explained the trusteeship with a tone that made the legal sound almost pastoral: an oversight period, a schedule of behaviors and actions, verifiable by documents and the testimony of care providers. It was not a theatrical forgiveness contract. It was an instrument designed by someone who had lived long enough to want to bind his intentions to reliability. The trustees would look for sustained caregiving, financial responsibility evidenced by reasonable accounts, and contributions to community welfare. A period of 6 months was a realistic frame, she said. Henrique added the necessary legalities. It is not a sentimental condition, he said. It is pragmatic. The trust looks to ensure that the legacy is not simply reclaimed by someone who can deliver optics of repentance for a week. It wants proof. Proof. The word was both a bridge and a barricade. Flávio listened, and the thing inside him that wanted to be forgiven without work shrank a little. He felt exhausted, but also oddly calmed by the structure. If proof was required, then proof could be given through action. The alternative, waiting for his life to be dictated by outside condemnation, appeared less tolerable. He accepted the trustees' parameters and began to live within a frame that had both restriction and possibility. He visited Valdemar twice a day when he could. He changed dressings and sat with him while the old man told stories that had been compressed into fragments during his absence. The story of a factory built from borrowed bricks and stubborn hands, the names of people who had given shifts in exchange for meals. Valdemar spoke not to excuse, but to show how a life like his accumulates into what others call wealth. "What I wanted," Valdemar said one afternoon as they watched the garden in a softness of light, "was not that you would have money because you can spend it. I wanted you to have what money is supposed to buy, the ability to make others' lives more bearable." Flávio had been a man who believed success meant abundance without effort. Now he was learning that abundance was complicated, sometimes a ledger full of entries of unglamorous choices. The public continued to hum with old outrage and new pieces. The initial fury had moved on, but the record remained. Whenever a new article referenced his name, commenters recycled the clip, the phrase, "never come back," and the memory of his dismissal and denial. That phrase, which had been a slingshot in the beginning, now hung in the air like an accusation. He began in private to repeat it to himself, and then to add, "But I did come back." Speaking the truth in this way was not performance,
It was practice. Work became his catechism. The scooter saved him in practical terms. He could pay for gas and parts from the modest wages, and in psychological terms, the route demanded presence. He started early, carrying packages to apartments that smelled of fresh paint and to clinics that smelled of medicine and hope. He learned the names of building superintendents and how to navigate the frailty of elevators that stop between floors. Little by little, his ledger of small, honest acts grew into a fabric that felt less like punishment and more like repair. He also began to make small gestures that had nothing to do with restitution and everything to do with empathy. He brought extra water to the regulars who had been waiting for a bus in noon heat. He shared sandwiches with fellow riders who had no time to eat. He left a bag of groceries at Irene's doorstep with a note, a thank you for your watchfulness. She opened the door and said nothing for a long minute, then pulled him inside and made him coffee. "You're quieter these days," she said, her voice rough with years and kindness. "You listen." Listening became a skill he didn't know he'd lacked. Once, delivering to a small nonprofit that received funds from Valdemar's redirected cash, he stayed to help unload boxes of blankets and saw firsthand the life his grandfather had intended to be a part of. The director of the nonprofit, a soft-spoken woman named Sonia, took him through a tour of the facility, a room where volunteers taught job skills to young adults, a kitchen that fed 60 people twice a week, a cot that had been the difference between sleep and the outdoors for someone in winter. Seeing the machinery of care made the will's directives feel less like punishment and more like a blueprint for justice. When he mentioned the will and the safe, Sonia did not ask for spectacle. She asked simply if he would help with logistics. "We need someone who knows the city and can coordinate pickups," she said. "You're good at that." He began informally at first to help, scheduling a van here, delivering surplus food there. These were tasks that required little more than organization, patience, and reliability. He found, to his surprise, that he liked it. There was satisfaction in connecting surplus to need.
There was a deep, quiet pleasure in being reliable in ways that didn't advertise themselves. The trustees watched. They took notes. They conversed with Enrique. They observed not only hours of care, but the quality of his attention. Letters from nurses, from coordinators at the nonprofit, even from Camila, the fellow courier, were compiled into a dossier that slowly, stubbornly changed the tenor of the case. Then came a day of acute crisis that could have undone everything. Valdemar, who had been steady in his watery patience, suffered a fall at home. The fracture was more than the body could easily bear. Hospitalization followed, with surgery and a long recovery. The hospital bed became both a site of pain and a site of learning. Flávio slept in a chair by his grandfather's bedside for nights on end, his body folding into a new, more patient kind of endurance. He learned on those nights the small liturgies of caretaking. He learned to temper coffee to the exact temperature Valdemar preferred. He learned to put a cool cloth across a feverish forehead. He learned to sit very still as nurses performed their rounds, answering questions with the kind of clarity that comes from being the person who has to relay information. Those long watches formed a different kind of alchemy. The public's old shouts seemed distant, their echoes repurposed into an urgency to be present. There was, too, a moment of sharp, humiliating clarity. The hospital required paperwork and guarantees, and some accounts were still frozen. There was a night when he had to stand in the fluorescent light of a billing office and explain with a voice that could not hold up the ledger of his previous life that he was trying to make things right. The clerk, a woman whose compassion was not absent, but who had rules to uphold, helped him file a payment plan and added a handwritten recommendation for financial counseling that was both helpful and bleak. It was in that liminal space, between the sterile air of the hospital and the warm, lemon-scented kitchen of his childhood, that the trustees convened what they called a reassessment. They were practical about it. They had to see consistency. They requested a period of 6 months documentation and testimonies. They outlined specific benchmarks: regular caregiving, involvement in community initiatives, a demonstrated plan for financial stability that did not rely on reckless spending or vanity. The restoration, they said, would not be a single event. It could be partial, oriented to projects that reinforced Valdemar's values: community funding, support for elder care, perhaps seed money for ventures that generate social good. "When you say partial," Flávio asked, "what do you mean?" "We are prepared," Camille, the executor, said, to consider allocating a portion of the estate to support a social enterprise that you and your parents can run together, if it meets criteria and if the trustees are satisfied with your conduct.
The intent is restorative, not indulgent. It was not a handout, it was a framework. It required work, oversight, and accountability. Flávio listened and felt the old reflex: reach for the ladder, climb fast, hibernating somewhere that might never fully return. He realized, as if coming up to air, that he had been searching for an off-ramp from being a better person, that the redemption he sought was never a prize, but a sequence of decisions. He accepted the terms, partly because he now believed in the value of work, partly because he feared losing the only chance to make something useful out of the ruin. During the months that followed, his life condensed into a rhythm of caregiving, career shifts, and community organization. He and Marta began to cook meals for a group of older neighbors who could not leave their apartments easily. Valdemar, when he was able, taught basic woodworking in the back garden to a small cohort of neighborhood teens, an apprenticeship that produced simple benches and, more importantly, a sense of earned competence. The hands that had once done invisible favors now practiced making things in public. There were setbacks. A vendor for the nonprofit missed a delivery and tempers flared. A newspaper ran a piece that framed everything as a public spectacle of atonement, and the fundraising thermometer for the charities ticked upward but unevenly. There were moments when Flávio, exhausted after a double shift, would stand on the porch and pace like a man counting ceiling tiles by accident. He had never thought endurance could be taught by repetition, but it was. And yet the small victories piled, anonymous and rich. A child in the community apprenticeship program, Marco, built a bench and brought it to the park with pride. An elderly woman who had been lonely received a visit every week because Marta made that a rule. The nonprofit received a steady stream of donations, partly, it seemed, because the story had drawn attention to the work the charities did, not merely the scandal that had sparked them. One afternoon in late spring, Enrique called to say a review was scheduled. The trustees had received letters, time logs, medical notes, and notes from the nonprofit. They wanted to meet with the family to discuss the possibility of allocating seed funding for a community venture that mirrored Valdemar's ideals, a place that could provide work to the marginalized and shelter to elders who needed dignity, not pity. It won't be all the estate, Camille said. That's not the point. But it could be a meaningful allocation if the trustees agree. When the trustees arrived, they were not dramatists. They were practical people with lined faces and a capacity for both skepticism and compassion. They noted, with the kind of precision an accountant would admire, the changes: the steady caregiving schedule, the letters from nurses, the invoices showing he had paid what he could on time, the testimonies of community leaders. They asked the hard questions: what long-term plans he envisioned, how the enterprise would be governed, how profits would be reinvested into social aims. Flávio answered with a mixture of humility and a clarity he had not possessed before. "We could open a small kitchen-cum-workshop," he said. "A place where older people can cook and share meals, where young people can learn trades. Not a charity that gives handouts, but a place where work is the dignity and where proceeds fund elder care and medical needs in the community." The idea was modest and rooted in the practicality he'd seen in Sonia's nonprofit. Valdemar smiled, the kind of smile that was small and private but honest. Marta pressed his hand. The trustees conferred, and with the cautious optimism of people who had helped draft the last intention of a man, recommended an allocation, enough to launch a modest enterprise, run with stringent oversight, with clear metrics for social impact. It would not restore the lifestyle Flávio had once known. It would not purchase a car with the gleam of exemption. But it would place agency in their hands to do something that mattered beyond private consumption. It would keep the core of the estate's purpose, care and dignity, alive. The day the trustees signed the letter of intent, there was a small celebration at the house, a simple lunch Marta insisted on preparing, the kind of pasta that had been a Sunday ritual for years. A pot of sauce simmered on the stove, rich with garlic and the smell of tomato and herbs. It was not a meal of winners and losers. It was a meal of people who had sat through hard conversations and chosen work. Flávio stood at the counter and stirred while Valdemar tended to the bread. The kitchen was modest, light filtering through a glass bottle on the sill. For the first time in months, there was no need to rehearse contrition for the cameras.
There was only the honest motion of stirring and tasting and adding salt. "I thought once," Valdemar said as he sliced bread, "that success was the thing you arrived at and then could put on the shelf. I was wrong. The shelf gathers dust. Work keeps the house warm." They began to plan the kitchen's menu, a small storefront attached to a workshop, apprenticeship programs, partnerships with local hospitals for meal provision. They drafted a governance plan with the trustees and set up a board that included community members: Sonia from the nonprofit, Irene as neighborhood representative, a nurse from the hospital, and Henrique as a legal observer. The arrangement was a messy compromise between idealism and accountability. When the doors of the new enterprise, Raconto, opened, it was with the kind of small fanfare that suits humble beginnings: a ribbon cut by Marta, a few local reporters who came less for scandal than for a human interest angle, and neighbors who brought flowers. The menu was priced to be accessible. There was a sliding scale for those who needed help.
The back room smelled of woodworking. There was a notice board with a framed photograph of Valdemar and Marta alongside a simple note explaining the mission: dignity through work. Raconto did not fix everything. There were days when the funds were tight and the bills felt heavy. There were nights when the charity's donations lagged and volunteers were ill. But there was also laughter that came unbidden: a teenager laughing at a mismeasured batch of dough, an elderly woman telling a story that made the room pause in admiration. The place did what Valdemar had wanted. It turned private legacy into public good. As for Flávio, the work never stopped being a school. He learned how to balance a budget with an honesty that respected the trustees' oversight. He navigated payroll and supply orders. He learned to answer a child's question about a tool with patience and clarity. He learned, too, how to apologize without theatrics when mistakes were made. The old reflex to hide behind bright shirts or easy charm faded. There were moments when the past returned in sharper ways. Rogerio tried to broker a return to the corporate world, offering a consultancy that would have been lucrative but required a public performance of contrition he did not feel ready to give. Flávio refused. Daniela, his old assistant, sent a message that was at once private and strange. She had started work with a foundation and wanted to partner. They arranged a meeting that was professional and open-handed. Not everyone was an antagonist. The story was not a neat morality play. Time, the trustees said, would be the judge of consistency. Months passed and the dossier thickened. Testimonials from hospital staff spoke of his nights at Valdemar's bedside. Letters came from parents of apprenticeship students who had found work and steadiness. The nonprofit supply lines improved. The social thermometer, small as it was, registered a shift in local sentiment. People who had once pronounced judgment now came in quietly to volunteer or to order a meal. When the trustees convened their final review, they recommended a partial release of funds dedicated to the expansion of Raconto, a modest kitchen extension, proper tools for the workshop, and seed capital to hire 2 full-time coordinators, one to manage apprenticeships and another to anchor elder outreach. They did not recommend, nor would they authorize, a return of personal wealth to Flávio. The point was not punitive but practical. Valdemar had intended his legacy to do good. The trustees would ensure it did so. Flávio read the trustee's letter in the kitchen office, hands wrapped around a new mug, his fingers still smelling of dough and varnish. At first, he felt a flash of that old desire, to be personally restored to prior comforts. It was a quick thing, like a cold wind. Then he watched Valdemar across the room, carving a small toy for a child, and Marta wiping a counter with the patient care of someone who had always tended to people. He heard the chatter of apprentices and the hum of conversation in the dining room. The choice, when it came, felt less like loss than clarity. He could have insisted, pursued litigation, used the media to make a spectacle of his claim. Instead, he signed the consent for the trustee's recommendation with a hand that did not shake. He wrote a brief note to the executor, asking that the funds be used to scale Raconto and that a portion be reserved for a small grant program to assist elders with urgent medical expenses. He included, beneath the legal line, a sentence that surprised even him. "If my life is to be measured by what I have given back, let it be this." At the announcement of the trustee's decision, a small press piece described Raconto's expansion not as a triumph of scandal, but as a modest success, a family that turned inheritance into social good. The headlines were kinder to the effort than to the man who had been the initial source of disgrace.
But no list of headlines mattered as much as the way people ate and worked together under one roof. The final months before the formal closing of the trustees' oversight were marked by new routines. The apprentices built a small bench that was then placed in the park with a plaque reading, "For work and rest." Valdemar's health stabilized. Physical therapy sessions became a regular feature of the week. Marta taught a Wednesday night class at Recanto on preserving recipes. A group of women from the neighborhood learned how to can tomatoes and to make sauce that tasted like memory. One evening, after a long day, they gathered for a communal meal. The kitchen filled with laughter and the clatter of plates. Marta ladled sauce onto long strands of freshly made pasta, while Valdemar sat at the head of a table that had been built by the apprentices. Flávio stood by the counter, a simple apron tied at his waist, and watched. The light in the room was warm, the kind of light that did not try to flatter, but to reveal. He thought for a moment of the exact phrasing he'd used on the porch months earlier. The words were still lodged in the public consciousness, played back like a defining moment he could not fully erase. Yet here, at this table, those words felt transformed by context. They had once been an instrument of refusal. Now they hung in the archives of his life as evidence of a turning point. Marta caught his eye, and with a mischievous look that had survived years and trials, reached across and tapped his knuckles. "You came back," she said. He smiled, and it was not a performative grin, but a small, private thing. "I did," he answered. He did not need to promise to be perfect. He only needed to keep showing up. The trust had not bought him virtue. It had bought a chance to practice it under supervision. He practiced.
There was one last small ceremonial moment that closed the chapter more gently than any headline could. The safe, the one that had sat beneath the window like a dormant moon, was opened in a different way, not as an altar of accusation, but as an archive. The executor, with the trustees and the family present, cataloged its contents: ledgers, photographs, the small thumb drive that contained scanned documents and recordings of decisions Valdemar had made to protect the family. They archived the materials with an intention: to preserve memory and to create transparency. Some documents were entrusted to Recanto's small library. Others were copied to the nonprofit's records. The leather notebook remained with Marta. She kept it, she said, because memory belongs to those who live it. The fingered pages that had once been the private accounting of a life were now a public ledger of intent. There were no revelations of villainy, no dramatic secret accounts, just the slow accumulation of a life lived with choices, some generous, some costly. The thumb drive included a recording where Valdemar, in his own gruff voice, described why he had made the choices he had: to ensure dignity, to carve safety where none had been obvious. When they finished cataloging, Valdemar slipped the safe's lid closed. It was not with a sense of finality, but with a sense of completion. The archive was now a part of the community. Months later, Recanto held a small festival to mark its first year. There were simple games, an outdoor table long enough to seat many, and a plate of Marta's macaronata steaming in a span of midday sun. The apprentices served who had once been unsure of their place in the world. Volunteers laughed at small missteps. Neighbors who had once been skeptical came and ate, and then came again. Flávio moved between the tables, offering refills and listening to stories. He saw in the faces of those around him the narrow miracle that was not mystical but practical, lives that had been given room to breathe. A child from the workshop ran up, dropped a handprint on his apron with sauce, and declared earnestly, "You taught me to use a chisel." "Then use it well," he said, and meant it. The cameras that came that day were fewer. The story had softened into a human interest piece that for once paid attention to work instead of scandal. They filmed Marta stirring sauce with a concentration that looked like prayer, and Valdemar showing a young apprentice how to sand the edge of a bench. The footage would later return as a small, intimate clip that kept the internet's appetite for narrative alive, but less reflexively cruel. At the end of the day, when the tables were cleared and the sun pared the edges of the sky with an orange wash, they sat down together. There was a plate of pasta for each of them, a simple, honest meal. Marta told a story about a time when she and Valdemar had been newly married and how they had built things with less money than patience. The story made them laugh. Outside, a young courier, one of the people who had taught him geometric secrets of the route, parked a battered bicycle. Flávio watched him and felt the small, sly contentment of someone who had traded grand ambitions for small, steady gains. He put his fork down and reached across the table, took Valdemar's hand and squeezed it. "Thank you," he said, though he could not claim to have earned forgiveness in a single line. It was gratitude, which was not the same as absolution, but held its own quiet power. Valdemar's eyes were a rough coastline of life, lined with the weathering of years. "We did what we could," he answered. "We tried to make something out of what we had. You came back. That is worth more than anything I can write into a will." Outside, the streetlights clicked on, and the neighborhood folded into night. The safe, now empty of its commanding secrecy, sat quietly in the house, interesting only to those who cared about where things had been kept. The phrase that had once been a shout had been recontextualized, not erased, but absorbed into a larger narrative of failure and repair. Words have the power to define us for a moment, but actions, carefully accrued, define us for a lifetime. They washed the dishes together, elbow to elbow, in the warm steam. The clang of plates against enamel was domestic and ordinary, music for a family that had remade itself. At one point, Marta looked over and said without irony, "You can come home anytime." He smiled. The phrase, simple and exact, had replaced the one he had once used to cast them out. It made a small, bright incision in him. When the trustees' oversight ended, it was not with trumpets, but with a report. Benchmarks met, programs funded, a modest but meaningful increase in community services. The estate's redirection had not been a punishment in the moralizing sense, but a redirection of purpose. The family had been invited to steward what remained of its power towards sustained care. The public did what it always does. Some applauded, some dismissed, headlines rotated. But inside the house on the small street where the paint had once flaked and now seemed freshly brushed, life moved with a steadier cadence. Recanto hummed through weekdays, teenagers learned tools, elders ate warm plates of food with names they recognized. On a patio with a view of the small garden and the now quiet street, Flávio fixed his bike for a delivery and paused to photograph a small framed family photo that had been placed on a shelf in the cafe. A picture of a young boy with a gap-toothed grin, Valdemar's arm thrown across his shoulders. He posted it to a modest account with a short caption, "New Beginnings." The photo did not go viral. It did not need to.
The safe, which had once been a secret container beneath the oak console, was now a quiet archive in the community library, its brass tag polished and its contents cataloged. It had performed what it was meant to reveal responsibility and to hold memory. The secret it had contained had not been a dramatic treasure chest, but a list of commitments. Its revelation had been the catalyst for a long, arduous, and necessary repair. He had started as a man who thought success was the absence of accountability. He ended not with a certificate from the internet, but with the knowledge of how to keep promises and the habit of showing up. The house at dusk smelled of tomato and basil. The scooter's engine was soft in the driveway. The apprentices were closing the shop and counting the day's takings with the humility of those who knew their work was part of the world's small machinery. When he locked up and walked up the path to the porch, Marta was waiting with a bowl of pasta for him to take home. Valdemar watched from his chair with a contentment that was not naive. He had seen storms come and go, but was steadier than it had been months before. Flávio sat and ate, and the flavors filled him like an ordinary benediction. Before he left, Marta took his hand and squeezed it in a way that was both maternal and practical. "You're home," she said. He nodded, because no more words were necessary. He had said the thing he had once shouted at them and had come back. The house was open to him in a new way, not because he had regained former comforts, but because he had rejoined a family with a willingness to serve, to labor, and to be accountable. He walked back down the street toward the scooter, the dusk folding around him, and for a moment the memory of the Porsche, its polished chrome, the slam of that door, felt like another life. He started the scooter with a practiced turn of the key, and the engine hummed a low, dependable note. "Never come back," he thought of the line once more, not as a curse, but as a monument to a lesson learned. He said it softly, this time to himself, and then he tucked it away where lessons belong, part of a ledger, part of a narrative, a marker of the man he had been and the work he now chose to do. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that redemption is built from small, steady acts. And if you want more stories about family, choices, and second chances, subscribe for the next one.